Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Gonzalez, and this is the third installment in my 5-part lesson on the United States and World War II. In this installment, we're going to look at the attack on Pearl Harbor, America's entrance into the war, and America's early mobilization efforts. As I mentioned in the previous installment, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937, and along the way conducted some pretty unspeakable atrocities, such as the rape of Nanking, in which Japanese soldiers murdered somewhere between 100 and 300,000 Chinese civilians. Events such as these caused concern, to say the least, amongst American government officials. And President Roosevelt started to put pressure on Japan to pull its troops out of China. One thing that he did was he moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet closer to Japan. To do this, he moved it from its original base at San Diego, California, to a new location at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. He also agreed to place an embargo on all shipments of oil going to Japan. As I've mentioned earlier, Japan was very poor in natural resources. It relied very heavily on imports. That was a big motivating factor for Japan invading China, was to try to obtain natural resources like oil and iron ore and rubber and so forth. So when President Roosevelt agreed to cut off America's supply of oil to Japan, this was a pretty heavy blow to the Japanese war effort. 90% of Japanese oil came from the United States. So if Japan was going to carry on its war in China, it was going to have to find another source of oil. Well, the best option appeared to be the Dutch East Indies, what is today the nation of Indonesia. At the time, it was a Dutch colony. And the problem with that was, if Japan were to attack the Dutch East Indies, they would be coming perilously close to the Philippines. And as you should remember from the Spanish-American War, the Philippines at this point in time were an American colony. Japan figured that if they came too close to the Philippines, this would be seen as a threat by the United States, and they would send their Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese High Command decided that they would launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and knock out America's Pacific Fleet before seizing the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. So in late November of 1941, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers started making their way toward Hawaii. At the same time, Japanese diplomats were in Washington, D.C., trying to negotiate some kind of agreement. The United States said that they would begin shipping oil to Japan only if they pulled all of their troops out of China. This was something Japan was not willing to do. So, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise aerial attack on Pearl Harbor. 19 ships were sunk, some of them battleships, some of them destroyers, some of them cruisers. 188 American planes were destroyed on the ground. Very few made it into the air. And over 2,400 American sailors were killed. The Japanese only lost 29 planes and 5 miniature submarines. Very soon afterward, the Japanese attacked the Philippines. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt went to Congress and asked that they declare war on Japan. He began his speech with one of the most famous lines in American history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress declared war that day. 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy both declared war on the United States. The U.S. had officially entered World War II. Now that we had entered the conflict, we had to prepare for it. We had to mobilize. Obviously, if you're going to fight a war, the first thing you need is an army. Over the course of World War II, 6 million Americans would volunteer to fight. But even this was not quite considered enough to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan. So, over the next 4 years, 10 million additional Americans would be drafted. Now, and that tends to surprise some people that more Americans were drafted during World War II than actually enlisted. Now, obviously, an army is not going to be prepared if it's not supplied. So, factories began to produce military material, tanks, machine guns, you name it, airplanes. And some companies were actually very reluctant to do this. They did not want to make the switch from automobiles to airplanes. So the government offered to pay for all of the material that was needed to build this war material. But they would allow the companies to keep the profits from selling the material. Well, that's a pretty good deal. You don't have to pay for the material, but you get to keep the money you make from selling the finished product. And American factories made a killing off of this during the war. World War II is considered the official end of the Great Depression. There was a job for everyone. You could serve in the army, you could work in a factory. There was no shortage of jobs after Pearl Harbor. To feed the army, the government turned to rationing, just as it had during World War I. During World War II, citizens were given ration coupons. If you wanted to buy bread, you had to have a coupon for bread. If you used all your coupons in a certain, by the end of the week, you simply had to wait until you got a new set of coupons. And this was done to make sure that the government had enough money to feed the troops. Just like in World War I, the government urged Americans to grow victory gardens. Grow your own food so there'll be enough food left to feed the troops. And like in World War I, the government helped pay for the war by selling war bonds. They essentially borrowed money from the American people with the promise that they would pay it back later with interest. Very quickly, I want to take a look at women and minorities during the war years. Women's roles changed dramatically during this time period. The most famous image in regards to women in World War II is, of course, Rosie the Riveter, who is on the right side of your screen. Women really went to work in large numbers for the first time because, one, the men were all gone fighting the war, so women had to take their place. We usually picture women like Rosie working in an aircraft factory, helping build airplanes and machine guns and ammunition, and that definitely did happen. In fact, by 1943, more women than men were working in aircraft factories. However, most women who went to work during the war did not work in the weapons industry. They simply took an office job that their husbands or brothers or whoever had left behind when they went to fight the war. As far as minorities go, African Americans. So, as we hopefully know by now, African Americans had been dealing with discrimination, not just in the South, but in the North as well, but especially the South, ever since the end of Reconstruction. And many African Americans saw the war as their chance to finally prove their worth and earn equality. Probably the most famous example of African Americans in World War II is the Tuskegee Airmen. Back in 1881, as you should remember, Booker T. Washington created the Tuskegee Institute, which was meant to teach vocational skills to African Americans. By the time World War II broke out, a Tuskegee included a civilian flight school, and this was incorporated by the U.S. government when the war broke out, and they used it to train African American pilots who fought with a distinction in World War II. There was a little bit of hesitation to let African Americans fight, but First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt actually made a trip to Tuskegee, and she insisted that one of the African American pilots take her for a ride in his plane just to prove that she was confident in their flying skills. As far as African Americans go, the Double V campaign is pretty important. It stands for double victory. They were trying to win the victory in Germany and Japan, but also win a victory for themselves at home. And they argued that the government should protect their rights because that would Germany would not be able to argue that that the United States had its own problems as well. As far as Native Americans go, the Navajo Code Talkers are fairly famous. They would use their Native American language to send messages back and forth. Obviously, you want to send messages using code during wartime because you don't want the enemy to know what you're up to. As far as Mexican Americans, there was the Bracero program in which Mexican migrants were allowed to come into the United States and take up jobs as farm workers. So the American government would be able to produce enough food to feed the troops. And the Zoot Suit riots, I'm going to let you just read about that on your own in the textbook. But as far as Japanese Americans, they really had the short end of the stick. In February of 1942, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this ordered that all Japanese Americans within a certain area of the western United States be relocated into internment camps. And they stayed there for the next 4 years. They were given 72 hours to sell their homes. They could only take a small portion of their belongings.